Prince George is second in line to the throne, 13 years old, and already the palace is carefully managing what the world gets to see. But sources suggest the version of George that's been constructed for public consumption is only half the story. There are details about his schooling, his personality, his future that have quietly surfaced and never made it into any official narrative. What does the future king actually look like up close? And why has the palace been so deliberate about what stays hidden? This is what you never knew about Prince George at 13. Prince George turned 13 on July 22, 2026. That sentence carries more weight than it might first appear, because the boy the world has watched grow up in carefully managed glimpses is now, officially, a teenager. And the transformation is no longer something you can talk around. Kensington Palace marked the birthday the way it always does. A new photograph, taken by Matt Porteous at Kensington Palace in June. George standing with his hands in his suit pockets, smiling. But sources suggest the more revealing image came separately. A video of George on a beach, climbing rocks with his brother Louis, swinging a cricket bat, petting a dog. Genuinely unguarded in a way palace portraits rarely are. Then there was the Wimbledon footage. George standing next to Kate, almost as tall as she is now. That detail landed differently for a lot of people. You can read a birthday statement and file it away. But watching a child physically close the gap on his mother registers somewhere deeper. What most people processed as a routine birthday moment was actually something more significant. The palace has been quietly shaping the story of who George is. The photographs they select, the videos they release, the details they include. Nothing is accidental. But what those images don't show is where this story actually starts. And that beginning is considerably more dramatic than a beach video. The date is July 22, 2013. At 4:24 p.m., inside the Lindo wing of St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington, Prince George Alexander Louis entered the world. And within minutes, the crowds gathered outside already knew. Cheers broke out before any official announcement. The kind of noise that only happens when something genuinely historic lands. Sources suggest the level of global attention that day was almost impossible to overstate. Networks had stationed cameras outside the Lindo wing for weeks. Correspondents flew in from dozens of countries. This was not standard royal coverage. This was the first child of the man who would one day be king, and the world treated it accordingly. Now here is the detail the official story tends to gloss over. William himself later admitted he had no idea what he was doing. His words, not mine. He described the early nappy attempts as a disaster. A future king of England, completely undone by standard infant logistics. It was genuinely disarming in a way the palace clearly didn't script. Then came the name. 2 full days passed before any announcement. 2 days of international speculation, of bookmakers adjusting odds by the hour, of front pages left blank waiting. On July 24th, the palace finally confirmed it. George Alexander Louis. George for its weight. 6 kings before him carried it. Alexander quietly powerful. Louis Personal, a nod to Lord Mountbatten, the great uncle who shaped both Charles and William. Each name was deliberate. Nothing about that sequence was accidental. But sources suggest the name wasn't just about honoring history. It was also about signaling something forward-looking. A declaration about the kind of monarchy this child would eventually inherit. And that inheritance, it turns out, had already been quietly rewritten before George was even old enough to hold a cricket bat. The question is, who changed it, and what exactly did they change? Now, before George could ever sit in a classroom or swing that cricket bat on the beach, something had to change at a legal level. Something fundamental. Something sources suggest most people walked straight past without realizing its full significance. On April 25, 2013, 3 months before George was born, the succession to the Crown Act received royal assent. Parliament had rewritten a rule that had governed the British throne for over 300 years. The old law, stretching back to the Act of Settlement in 1701, said this: a younger son would always jump ahead of an older daughter in the line of succession. 1,000 years of male preference primogeniture ended by a single piece of legislation passed just in time. Just in time for George. But here's what that change actually means in practice, because people often miss the second part of the story. When Princess Charlotte arrived on May 2, 2015, she became 4th in line, and she stayed there. She did not drop when Prince Louis was born in April 2018. Under the old rules, Louis would have leapfrogged her automatically. Under the new act, Charlotte held her place permanently. Sources suggest the palace understood the signal this sent, that the throne's future shape would be determined by birth order alone, not gender. A cleaner line, a more defensible one, and that matters for George specifically, because the monarchy he will eventually inherit is one where the rules have been modernized beneath him, where his sister has equal standing, where the legitimacy of succession cannot be challenged on those old grounds. The inheritance was rewritten before he could walk. But here's the question nobody fully answers. What did it actually look like when 3 generations of heirs stood in the same frame for the first time, knowing every one of them had a date with this throne? Now, the succession rules had been rewritten. The heir's place was locked in. But sources suggest the world needed to see it, not just read it in legislative text. And what it looked like was genuinely extraordinary. In 2013, for the first time in living memory, the British monarchy had 3 generations of direct heirs in the same frame: Charles, William, George. One family photograph, and inside it, the entire future of the crown mapped out in a single image. Sources say the palace understood exactly what they were releasing, not just a family moment. A statement of institutional continuity at a time when the monarchy's long-term credibility was quietly being questioned. Queen Elizabeth was still on the throne. She had reigned for over 60 years. And suddenly, there were 3 men in line behind her, each one waiting, aware of his position and deliberately placed in frame together for a reason. George, of course, had no idea. He was weeks old, but the image did its work regardless. And here's what sources suggest nobody fully registered at the time. George's arrival didn't just add a name to a list, it reshuffled everyone. Charles moved closer to irrelevance in public imagination. William became transitional. George became the destination. The question is, who surrounded him at that christening, and why those specific names were chosen? Now, the christening. October 23rd, 2013. Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. George was 3 months old, dressed in a replica of the Honiton lace robe first worn by Queen Victoria's eldest child in 1841, the original, too fragile to use. Sources suggest every detail was chosen to signal something specific: continuity, sanctity, and weight. The water used to baptize him was brought from the River Jordan, not symbolic water, actual water, flown in as it has been for senior royal christenings for generations. That detail never made the front pages, it should have. But the godparent list tells you the most. 7 names, none of them accidental. Zara Tyndall, Princess Anne's daughter, raised almost entirely outside the royal spotlight, who survived that existence intact. Sources suggest her inclusion was deliberate. A grounding influence chosen for what she represents, that royal life doesn't have to consume you. Then there's Hugh Grosvenor, the Duke of Westminster. He inherited one of Britain's largest private fortunes in 2016, reportedly worth over $10 billion. He was 25 when George was born. Sources close to the family suggest his godparent role wasn't ceremonial, it was strategic. A connection built early, held quietly. 7 godparents surrounding a 3-month-old future king, each one chosen, none of them random. So who actually got to shape George's early years in public, and how carefully was that access managed? Now, the christening gave George a circle of carefully chosen adults surrounding him from the start. But the real question sources kept asking was simpler and more pointed than that. How do you raise the future King of England without the world consuming him first? William and Kate's answer arrived early. In April 2014, George was barely 9 months old when he boarded a plane to New Zealand and Australia with his parents. Sources suggest the decision was deliberate, not just a family trip attached to an official tour, but a calculated signal about how this child would be presented. Visible, yes, but on their terms. The tour became one of the most watched royal visits in decades. A 9-month-old in a pram on the lawns of Government House in Wellington, grasping at a wombat, cameras everywhere. And yet, sources close to the Wales household say William and Kate structured every appearance with a clear boundary, public access to the moment, nothing beyond it. Then came the Obama encounter in April 2016. Barack and Michelle Obama visited Kensington Palace, and what the cameras captured was the future king in blue pajamas, well past his bedtime, appearing at the top of the stairs. 3 years old. Sources say it was entirely unplanned. But nothing about that image felt accidental to palace observers. A future king meeting a sitting American president in pajamas, completely unbothered. That image is only half the story though. What sources suggest was actually happening behind it was a consistent parental strategy: allow the world its moments, then close the door completely. Lambrook School, Norfolk weekends, ordinary supermarkets. The counterbalance to every choreographed public appearance was a private life that was genuinely protected. Nothing individually looked like a policy. Collectively, it absolutely was one. And the question that strategy quietly raises is this: what did George himself actually want when the cameras weren't watching? Now, here is what the cameras actually captured when nobody was choreographing the moment. The birthday video the palace released showed George on a beach swinging a cricket bat. Not posed, not stiff, just a 13-year-old completely absorbed in what he was doing. And sources suggest that single image, lasting only seconds, told people more about who George actually is than any official portrait taken in a formal suit ever could. Because the real George, according to those close to the Wales family, is genuinely sports-obsessed. Football first, Aston Villa specifically. Sources say William has taken him to matches, and the bond that builds in those stadium stands, the noise, the crowd, the total ordinariness of it, is entirely deliberate. Not a photo opportunity, just a father and son watching football. But sport is only half the picture. Kate has described George as a rascal. William once said his son gave something a rating of 20 out of 10. Not 10, 20. The kind of answer that tells you everything about a boy who finds enthusiasm easier than moderation, and who hasn't yet learned to filter himself for a room. Sources suggest his parents find that quality completely endearing even when it complicates things. And there's something important in that, because the institution George is being raised to lead has spent centuries rewarding restraint and punishing candor. A future king who gives things 20 out of 10 is, quietly, a different proposition from anything the palace has managed before. The rascal energy is real. It isn't manufactured warmth for public consumption. The people around the family describe a boy who is quick, funny, and genuinely competitive, someone who plays to win and notices when he doesn't, which raises the next question nobody has properly answered. If this is who George actually is, this unfiltered, sports-obsessed 20 out of 10 personality, why does something as basic as his surname keep quietly shifting beneath him? Now, here is something that sounds almost too bureaucratic to matter, but it tells you more about George's position than almost anything else. Prince George does not officially have a surname, not in the conventional sense. Royal children at his level operate above the need for one. The title does the work a surname would normally do, but when a surname is required, things get quietly complicated. At birth, he was known informally as George Cambridge. The Duchy of Cambridge was William and Kate's title, and the children carried it. Simple enough. But in September 2022, Charles acceded to the throne, and within hours, William became Prince of Wales. The children shifted accordingly. George Cambridge quietly became George Wales, same child, different name, no announcement. Sources suggest this kind of shift is deliberately unremarked upon. The palace prefers the change simply settle into place because commentary raises questions about how conditional these identities actually are. And that conditionality is the point. Every name George has carried has been a reflection of where his father stood, not who George himself is. His identity, even at its most basic documentary level, moves when William moves. And here is where something shifts. Because everything we've tracked across this story has been building toward a single institutional decision that will define the next 5 years of George's life. In September 2026, Kensington Palace released a statement. Kensington Palace can confirm that Prince George will attend Eton College from this September. No explanation of what was considered, what was rejected, what this cost. Just the announcement placed quietly into the world as though the outcome had never been in question. But sources suggest it very nearly was. The Wales family had reportedly visited Marlborough College, Kate's own school, coeducational, modern in approach, located in Wiltshire. In January, the Mail on Sunday was reporting confidently that all 3 children were headed there. Had that held, George would have become the first future monarch in British history to attend a coeducational secondary school. A genuine break from precedent, a deliberate signal about the kind of king William and Kate were preparing him to be. It didn't hold. Sources close to the family suggest George himself knew where he wanted to go. The boy who carries the weight of succession apparently also carries genuine feeling about continuing his father's path. William attended Eton. George wanted to follow him, and that was not a minor factor. It was the deciding one. So what does that decision mean in practical terms? The cost alone is striking, $60,298 per year for 5 years. An all-boys environment, ages 13 to 18, with around 270 students accepted per academic year. Located in Berkshire, a short distance from Windsor Castle, a geographic detail that is not accidental. 20 of Britain's 58 prime ministers attended Eton. Boris Johnson, David Cameron. The list carries its own argument. And now George walks into that same institution carrying a weight none of those alumni carried. Not just a family legacy, but an entire constitutional future. What is genuinely striking, though, is not the school itself. It is what the choice quietly revealed when George had real options placed in front of him. When a different, arguably more progressive path was genuinely available, he chose continuity. He chose the path his father walked. Sources suggest that tells you something about who George is becoming that no official portrait has yet managed to capture. Which raises the real question this entire story has been circling. Not where George is going to school, but what kind of king all of this is actually building toward. So here is what all of it actually adds up to. A boy born into the most scrutinized succession in modern British history, christened with water from the River Jordan, photographed alongside 3 generations of kings, carrying a surname that quietly shifted every time his father's title rose. A boy who spent his early years being managed carefully, deliberately, between the world stage and something resembling a normal childhood, who swings a cricket bat on a beach, scores Aston Villa matches out of 10, and apparently inherited his father's instinct for cheek. And now, at 13, he walks into Eton. Sources suggest the portrait that emerges from all of this is not the one the palace's official releases have been constructing. The official version gives you the suits, the smiles, the careful framing. What actually sits underneath is something more specific and, honestly, more interesting. A future king who, when genuinely given options, chose continuity. Who, according to people close to the Wales family, knew where he wanted to go before the decision was ever announced publicly. That kind of quiet certainty at 13 is not nothing. Now, no one can tell you what kind of reign is decades away. That is not what this is. But the signals that have quietly accumulated around George, the education, the personality glimpses, the way his parents have structured his visibility, they point toward someone being prepared with more intention than any previous heir at this age. And that is the part the palace has been careful to leave out of every official story told about him. Because here is what sources suggest and what this entire story has been circling toward. George is not just being prepared for a role, he is already, in small and deliberate ways, beginning to inhabit it. The question that nobody in the palace is answering yet is whether the institution he is walking into is ready for the version of that role he might actually decide to create. The crown just got one step closer. George wins the narrative, a teenager stepping deliberately into history. But Eton's doors haven't opened yet, and what he becomes inside them remains completely unknown. This wasn't a birthday, it was a beginning.